They thought he left me a hole of dust to mock my years of service, but the master knew that in a land of lies, the only thing more precious than gold is the truth that can burn a house down. Bento whispered to the empty air, his voice like the grinding of stones. He stood at the edge of the rocky outcrop, looking down into the darkness of a well that had not seen a drop of water in 20 years. Behind him, the laughter of the powerful echoed across the valley, but they didn't know that the silence of the dry earth was about to speak. What you are about to witness is a story of a legacy hidden where no one dared to look, a secret buried beneath layers of red dust and cruelty in the heart of the Brazilian Empire. Some things are worth more than freedom itself, and some debts can only be paid with the truth. Stay with me until the very end, because the transformation of this old blacksmith and the secret he carries will leave you breathless. Before we continue, I want to ask you to support our work by subscribing to the channel and, if this story touches your heart, leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10. Your engagement is what keeps these voices alive. The year was 1870, and the Paraíba Valley was a kingdom of coffee and shadows. The sun was a relentless master, beating down on the red earth until it cracked like an old wound. At Fazenda Santa Cruz, the air was thick, not just with the suffocating humidity, but with the smell of overripe coffee cherries and the lingering scent of decay. Once the jewel of the empire, the plantation was now a skeleton of its former glory. The coffee trees were yellowing, their leaves curling as if trying to hide from the debt collectors, and the grand big house with its white pillars and fine lace curtains was rotting from the inside out. In the center of this crumbling world stood the forge. It was a place of fire and soot, located just far enough from the big house to keep the smoke from staining the silk dresses of the masters, but close enough for the clinking of iron to be a constant reminder of who held the power. Bento, a man of 50 years, lived and breathed in that forge. His body was a map of the plantation's brutal history. His hands were thick and calloused, permanently stained with the black grease of the anvil. His back was slightly hunched, the result of decades spent bending over the glowing embers, and his eyes. His eyes were heavy with the weight of things unsaid. Bento was a master of his craft, but his skill brought him no joy. For years, he had been the one to forge the very chains that bound his brothers and sisters. Every time he hammered a rivet into a shackle, he felt a piece of his soul fracture. He was a man trapped in a paradox, respected by the other enslaved workers for his strength and proximity to the masters, yet viewed with a lingering suspicion. He lived in a small, cramped shed attached to the forge, isolated from the communal life of the Senzala. He was a man of silence, a man who had learned that in the Paraíba Valley, a closed mouth was the only way to keep your heart from being crushed. But the silence of the plantation was broken on a Tuesday morning, when the great bronze bell of the big house tolled with a rhythmic funeral heaviness. Colonel Custodio, the iron-fisted patriarch of Santa Cruz, was dead. Custodio had been a man of cold calculations and sharp edges. He had built Santa Cruz on a foundation of blood and brilliantly falsified ledgers. In his final days, as the fever took hold of him, he had become a ghost in his own hallways, whispering to the shadows and clutching a hollowed-out Bible as if it held the keys to heaven. To his sons he was a source of wealth. To his wife, Donna Isidora, he was a badge of status. But to Bento, he was the man who had owned his life, and now that ownership was about to take a very strange turn. The reading of the will took place in the library, a room drenched in shadows and the smell of old paper. Outside, the enslaved workers gathered in the heat, waiting to hear who their new masters would be. Inside, the legitimate sons sat in velvet chairs, their eyes greedy as the lawyer adjusted his spectacles. Donna Isidora stood by the window, her lace fan clicking like the heartbeat of a bird of prey. The shocks came quickly. The lands were crumbling, the debts were astronomical, and the legacy was a tangled mess of mortgages. But the greatest shock of all came when the lawyer cleared his throat and read the final codicil. "To my loyal blacksmith Bento," the lawyer read, his voice trembling slightly. "I leave no gold, no silver, and no freedom. I leave him the stone well on the northern ridge, and the right to whatever he finds at its bottom." A silence so heavy it felt physical descended on the room. A well? A dried-up, useless hole in the most barren, rocky part of the estate. The sons burst into a mocking laughter, that spilled out of the windows and reached the ears of the workers outside. It was a joke, a final, cruel jest from a dying man to a servant who had spent his life making chains. Donna Isadora's face hardened into a mask of pure contempt. She didn't see a gift. She saw an insult to her family's name. To give anything to a slave was a breach of the social order she fought so hard to maintain. She walked out of the library, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards, and headed straight for the forge. "You!" she spat, pointing a gloved finger at Bento, who stood at the entrance of his shed. "The Colonel's mind was gone at the end. He left you a hole of dust, and that is exactly what you are. Dust." She ordered the overseer to march Bento and the other workers to the northern ridge. She wanted the humiliation to be public. She wanted everyone to see the inheritance. When they reached the rocky outcrop, where the soil was so thin that not even weeds could grow, they stood around the circular stone rim of the old well. Isadora looked down into the dark, dry mouth of the pit, and then looked at Bento. With a slow, deliberate movement, she gathered her saliva and spat into the well. "There," she mocked, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Now your inheritance has some moisture. Enjoy your reward, blacksmith. It is all you will ever have." Bento said nothing. He stared into the darkness of the well, his face an unreadable mask of iron. But as the crowd dispersed and the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley, a small hand reached out and touched his arm. It was Tiana. She was only 14, a housemaid with eyes that seemed too large for her thin face. Her mother had been sold to the coffee plantations in the south years ago, and Bento had stepped into the void, carving her small wooden birds from scrap timber to give her something to hold on to in the dark. Tiana was the only person who could see past Bento's forged exterior. "Uncle Bento," she whispered, her voice trembling, "don't listen to them. The Colonel, he wasn't joking when he died." Bento looked at her, his brow furrowing. "He was a man of fever, child. He saw demons in the corners." "No," Tiana said, pulling him further away from the path where the overseer, Valerio, was watching. "I was there. I was the one who changed his linens when the others were too afraid of the sickness. In his last hour, he grabbed my hand so hard it bruised. He whispered about the deepest truth. He said it was hidden where the sun never reaches. He said the well wasn't for water. It was for the fire that would cleanse the house." Bento felt a sudden cold jolt in his chest, like a hammer hitting an anvil in the dead of winter. He looked back at the big house where the lights were flickering to life. He thought of the iron key he had forged years ago for the Colonel, a key that had disappeared shortly before the old man died. He remembered the Colonel's strange insistence on being left alone near that rocky ridge during his afternoon rides. But there was no time to think. Tiana's eyes were filled with a sudden, sharp terror. "Donna Isadora. She's talking to the labor broker from Rio Bento. I heard them in the pantry. She needs to pay the interest to the bank. She's going to sell me. She's going to sell me on Monday." The world seemed to tilt for Bento. The guilt he had carried for years, the guilt of the chains, the guilt of the silence, rose up in his throat like bile. He looked at the girl, the only thing he had left to love in a world that treated them like livestock. If Tiana was sold to Rio, she would be lost forever in the urban hell of the ports or the coffee houses. But there is something more, Bento thought, looking at the girl. Tiana wasn't just a victim. She was a witness. She knew things about the Colonel's final moments that no one else did. The way she spoke of the deepest truth wasn't the rambling of a child. It was a message. Bento gripped her shoulder, his massive hand surprisingly gentle. "Listen to me, Tiana. You stay in the shadows. Don't let the widow see you crying. I have a debt to pay, and I won't let your name be written in that broker's book." As the moon rose over the Paraíba Valley, looking like a silver blade ready to strike, Bento returned to the forge. He didn't sleep. He sat by the dying embers of his fire, the sound of the dry bucket hitting the bottom of the well echoing in his mind. He realized then that the Colonel hadn't left him a hole of dust. He had left him a weapon, but to reach it, he would have to go into the dark. He would have to face the very things he had spent 50 years trying to forget. And he knew that the overseer, Valerio, was already watching him, suspicious of the quiet blacksmith who had suddenly found a reason to hope. The open loop was there, hanging in the humid night air. What was at the bottom of a well that had no water? Why would a man who built his life on lies leave the truth to a slave? And most importantly, could a man who forged chains finally find the strength to break them? Bento stood up, his joints popping. He reached into a hidden crevice in the wall of his shed and pulled out a heavy iron hammer. It wasn't the one he used for work. It was one he had made in secret, balanced perfectly for a different kind of labor. "The truth is coming," he murmured, looking toward the northern ridge, "and it's thirstier than I am." But as he stepped out into the night, a shadow moved near the fence. A pair of boots crunched on the dry leaves. The hunt had already begun, and the blacksmith was no longer just a worker. He was a man with an inheritance that the world was about to envy and fear. But this was only the beginning. The real horror of what lay beneath the rocks was something Bento could never have imagined, and the price of uncovering it was about to get much higher. The shadow near the fence didn't stay a shadow for long. As the moon climbed higher, the figure stepped into the pale light, revealing the glint of a silver-handled whip tucked into a leather belt. It was Valerio, the overseer. He was a man who smelled of cheap tobacco and stale sweat, a man whose only joy in life was the sound of a plea for mercy that he never intended to grant. He looked at Bento, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of suspicion and a deep-seated hatred for the blacksmith's quiet dignity. "Wandering late, aren't you, blacksmith?" Valerio's voice was like a serrated blade. "The kernel is barely cold in the ground, and already you think the rules of Santa Cruz don't apply to you. That rocky ridge is off-limits after dark. If I catch you near that well again, I'll make sure your inheritance is the last thing you ever see." Bento didn't flinch. He tightened his grip on the heavy hammer hidden beneath his coat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I was just checking the latches on the paddock, Fighter. The wind is picking up, and the horses are restless." Valerio spat on the ground, a mimicry of the widow's earlier gesture. "Get back to your shed. And remember, the broker arrives from Rio in 2 days. Donna Isadora wants the housemaid ready and the inventory tight. Any trouble from you and I'll see you sold alongside the girl. Maybe a salt mine in the north will finally break that stiff back of yours." Bento turned away, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. He retreated to his shed, but sleep was a stranger. The overseer's threat only sharpened the urgency of his mission. He knew that the clock was ticking for Tiana, and the answer to her salvation, and perhaps his own, lay at the bottom of a hole that everyone else considered a joke. But there was something he needed first. He needed the key. He remembered the day he had forged it. It was 5 years ago, a winter morning when the mist clung to the coffee trees like a shroud. Colonel Custodio had come to the forge alone, his eyes darting around as if he were being followed. He had handed Bento a strange, intricate design, a key with a double-notched bit and a bow shaped like a weeping eye. Bento had spent 3 days at the anvil, perfecting the mechanism. When it was finished, the colonel hadn't tested it on a door or a chest. He had simply tucked it into his waistcoat and whispered, "If the world ever burns, Bento, remember that the coldest fire is kept in the dark." Bento knew the colonel was a man of many secrets, but he hadn't realized until now that the key was meant for the well. But where was it? The colonel had been buried with his finery, but Bento knew his old master too well. Custodio trusted no one, not even the grave. He would have hidden it in the place he spent his most private hours. The next morning, the plantation was a hive of frantic activity. The labor broker, a man named Senor Antunes, had arrived early. He was a vulture in a linen suit, his eyes calculating the muscle mass and teeth of every person he passed. Bento watched from the shadows of the forge as Antunes stood on the veranda of the big house, sipping coffee with Donna Isadora. Their voices carried on the breeze, discussing the price of Tiana's youth as if they were haggling over a sack of beans. "She's a delicate one," Antunes remarked, his voice oily. "The buyers in the capital prefer them refined. I can get a good price, but I need the papers signed by Monday." Donna Isadora's response was cold and sharp. "The papers will be ready. I've already had the judge's clerk prepare the transfer. Santa Cruz needs the liquidity, and the girl is surplus." Bento felt a surge of cold fury. He knew he had to act. He waited until the midday sun was at its peak, the hour when the heat was so intense that even the overseers retreated to the shade. He slipped away from the forge and headed toward the back entrance of the big house, the place where the servants brought in the laundry. He found Tiana in the kitchen, her eyes red from crying, her hands trembling as she polished the silver. When she saw Bento, she almost dropped a heavy platter. "Uncle Bento, you shouldn't be here," she hissed, looking over her shoulder toward the hallway. "Donna Isadora is in the parlor with the broker. If they catch you—" "The Colonel's Bible, Tiana," Bento whispered, his voice urgent. "Where is it? The one with the heavy leather binding and the brass clasps?" Tiana's eyes widened. "It's in his study. But the door is locked. Donna Isadora has the only key." "Not the only one," Bento murmured. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, thin piece of shaped iron he had fashioned that morning. It was a simple lockpick, a tool he had never used but knew the theory of by heart. He moved through the silent hallways of the big house like a ghost. This was a world of polished mahogany and French porcelain, a world built on the broken backs of his people. Every step he took felt like a desecration of the order the masters so cherished. He reached the study and, with a few practiced clicks, the heavy oak door swung open. The room smelled of stale tobacco and old secrets. He went straight to the bookshelf behind the desk. There it was, the heavy Bible. He pulled it down and opened it. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but as he reached the center of the book he felt a hollowness. He pressed a small hidden spring in the spine, and a section of the pages fell away, revealing a hollowed-out cavity. Inside sat the iron key with the weeping eye. Bento gripped it, the cold metal feeling like a brand on his palm. But there was something else in the cavity, a small folded piece of parchment. He opened it and read the frantic, spindly handwriting of a man who knew he was dying. "The land is a lie, the deeds are a theft, the well holds the weight of the debt I could never pay. Bento, if you find this, you are the only one with the hands strong enough to hold the truth. Forgive me, if the fire consumes you too." Bento tucked the key and the note into his shirt. He was about to leave when he heard footsteps in the hall. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps. Valerio. He barely managed to duck behind a heavy velvet curtain before the door opened. The overseer walked into the room, his eyes scanning the desk. He stopped at the bookshelf, his hand hovering near the spot where the Bible had been. For a heartbeat, Bento stopped breathing. He could see the sweat on the back of the overseer's neck. Valerio grunted, adjusted his belt and then turned to leave, but not before spitting on the rug. The man's arrogance was his only weakness. He didn't think a piece of property like Bento would ever dare to enter this room. Once the hallway was clear, Bento slipped out and made his way back to the forge. But he didn't stop there. He knew he needed more than just a key. He needed the history of the ridge. He went to the edge of the Senzala, to a small lopsided hut where old Simo lived. Simo was the oldest man on the plantation, a man whose memory stretched back to the days when the first coffee trees were planted. He was blind now, his eyes clouded over like milk, but he could hear the change in the wind before anyone else. "Simo," Bento whispered, sitting on the dirt floor beside the old man. "Tell me about the northern ridge. Tell me about the families who were there before the colonel built the big well." Simo turned his sightless eyes toward Bento, a sad smile touching his lips. "Ah, the ridge. People forget, Bento. They think the colonel carved this place out of the wilderness. But before the deeds were rewritten, that land belonged to others, free men, black farmers who had bought their way out of the chains and built a life on that rocky soil." Bento leaned in closer. "What happened to them?" "The colonel wanted the water," Simo said, his voice dropping to a rasp. "He wanted the spring that ran beneath the ridge. He offered to buy them out, but they refused. Then one night the fires came. The houses burned, the crops were salted, and the farmers, they vanished. The colonel stood before the judge in the city with original deeds that showed the land had always been his. He bribed the clerks, he killed the witnesses, and he built that well right over the spot where the main house had stood. But the earth has a memory, Bento. The spring dried up the day the blood hit the soil. The well has been empty ever since." Bento felt a shiver run down his spine. This was the master's sin. The very foundation of Santa Cruz was a crime. And if the documents at the bottom of the well proved it, then Donna Isadora wasn't just a widow. She was the beneficiary of a mass murder. "But Bento," Simon cautioned, reaching out a withered hand to catch the blacksmith's arm. "Be careful. The truth is a heavy thing. Many men have been crushed by it. The colonel couldn't live with it, and he was the one who buried it. What makes you think you can carry it to the surface?" "I have to," Bento said, his voice firm. "They're going to sell Tiana on Monday. I don't have time to be afraid." "Then go," Simo whispered. "But remember, the well doesn't just hold paper. It holds the ghosts of the ridge. If you're going down there, you'd better be prepared to see what's truly in the dark." Bento left the hut, the weight of the iron key pressing against his chest. He looked up at the northern ridge. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting the well into a deep purple shadow. He knew that tonight was the night. He would go down into the pit, and he would either find the weapon he needed, or he would become another ghost for the earth to swallow. But as he prepared his ropes and his lantern, he didn't see the figure watching him from the balcony of the big house. Donna Isadora was standing there, her lace fan still, her eyes fixed on the blacksmith. She didn't know about the key, but she knew that Bento was no longer the broken man he had been a week ago. And in her world, a slave with hope was more dangerous than a slave with a gun. "Valerio!" she called out, her voice cold and clear. The overseer appeared from the shadows below. "Yes, Sinha." "Follow him tonight," she ordered. "If he touches that well, don't just stop him. Make sure he never speaks again. I want the ridge silent by morning." The trap was set. The blacksmith was walking into a hole of dust, and the hounds were already at his heels. But what they didn't realize was that Bento wasn't just looking for water. He was looking for the fire that would burn their world to the ground. And you, who are watching this, do you believe that a man can truly change his destiny when the entire world is built to keep him down? The next moments in this story will change everything you think you know about justice. The moon was indeed a silver blade, sharp and cold, hanging over the jagged silhouette of the Paraíba Valley. Bento moved through the coffee groves like a shadow among shadows. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a dry twig sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the night. He carried a coil of heavy hemp rope, a lantern shielded by a thick cloth, and the iron key that felt like it was burning a hole through his shirt. He wasn't just a blacksmith tonight. He was a man descending into his own grave to see if life still flickered at the bottom. When he reached the northern ridge, the air changed. It was thinner here, colder, smelling of parched stone and ancient grudges. The well sat in the center of the rocky clearing, a circular mouth of jagged masonry that seemed to be gasping for a breath it hadn't tasted in 20 years. Bento looked back toward the big house. A single light flickered in the widow's window, a watchful eye that never seemed to close. He knew Valerio was out there somewhere, prowling the perimeter, but the blacksmith had no choice. Monday was coming, and with it, the end of Tiana's world. He secured the rope to a sturdy iron ring he had forged and bolted into the rock years ago, a task the colonel had ordered him to do in secret, long before the madness took hold. As he swung his legs over the edge, the darkness of the pit rose up to meet him, smelling of damp silt and the metallic tang of deep earth. "If the fire consumes me," Bento whispered, echoing the colonel's note, "let it at least burn the chains first." The descent was a grueling test of his aging muscles. His calloused hands gripped the rope, the fibers biting into his skin, but he felt no pain, only the rhythmic thud of his heart against his ribs. Down he went, deeper into the throat of the earth until the silver moonlight above was nothing more than a distant mocking coin. 10 feet, 20, 30. The air grew heavy and stale. He sat in the pitch blackness for a moment, listening to the silence. Then, with trembling fingers, he uncovered the lantern. The dim orange glow revealed a world of decay. The bottom of the well was choked with layers of fine silt, the rotted remains of wooden buckets, and the bleached, fragile bones of small animals that had fallen into the trap over the decades. It looked like exactly what the widow had called it, a hole of dust. But Bento remembered the colonel's whispers, where the sun never reaches. He began to clear the debris, his hands digging through the dirt with a frantic energy. He pushed aside the bones and the rot, his fingers searching for something that didn't belong to the earth. After nearly an hour of digging, his knuckles struck something hard, Not stone, metal. He cleared away the last layer of silt to reveal a heavy, lead-lined door set into the very floor of the well. It was a masterpiece of hidden engineering, designed to withstand moisture and time. In the center of the lead plate was a keyhole shaped like a weeping eye. Bento pulled the iron key from his shirt. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He slid the notched bit into the lock. It resisted for a heartbeat, years of grit fighting against the mechanism, but then, with a heavy, echoing clack, the bolt retracted. He hauled the lead door open. It didn't lead to a tunnel, but to a small, dry chamber, no larger than a coffin. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the humidity, were the secrets that had kept Colonel Custodio awake for 20 years. Bento pulled the bundles out, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He unwrapped the first one. It was a collection of ledger books, their leather covers cracked but the ink inside still sharp. As he flipped through the pages, the scale of the crime unfolded before his eyes. These weren't the ledgers shown to the bank or the imperial tax collectors. These were the real accounts. They showed a systematic campaign of bribery, the names of judges and clerks who had been bought with Santa Cruz gold, and the detailed plans for the cleansing of the northern ridge. But it was the second bundle that made Bento's blood run cold. They were original land deeds, stamped with the imperial seal, but with one crucial difference. They weren't in the name of the Custodio family. They belonged to the free black farmers old Simão had spoken of. Beneath the deeds were receipts of payment, proving that the debt for the land had been settled in full years before the colonel had purchased it. He didn't just kill them, Bento whispered, his voice cracking. He stole their very existence. Underneath the documents lay a small wooden box. Bento opened it, and the lantern light reflected off the dull, heavy glint of gold coins. Hundreds of them, a fortune hidden away as a final insurance policy against ruin. But at the very bottom of the box was a single sealed envelope addressed to him. With shaking fingers, Bento broke the seal. Inside was a formal letter of manumission, signed by the colonel and witnessed by a priest in the city 3 years ago. It was a document that declared Bento a free man, a document that should have been filed the day it was signed. But the colonel had kept it here in the dark, a final act of cowardice and control. Bento clutched the paper to his chest, a sob breaking from his throat. He was free. He had been free for 3 years, and yet he had spent those years bending over an anvil, making chains for others. The cruelty of it was a physical weight, a blow to the soul that hurt more than any whip. But he had no time for grief. He stuffed the ledgers, the deeds, the gold, and his freedom into a burlap sack. He had the weapon. He had the truth that could burn the big house to the ground. But as he reached for the rope to begin his ascent, a sound echoed down from the mouth of the well. A slow, rhythmic clapping. Bravo, blacksmith. Truly, a performance worthy of a free man. Bento looked up. Framed against the silver moon was the silhouette of Valerio. The overseer was leaning over the edge, a cruel smile visible even in the shadows. In his hand, he held a long, sharp knife. "I must thank the Sinha for her intuition," Valerio called down, his voice dripping with malice. "She knew you were digging for something. I didn't think you'd actually find it. But now, you've done the hard work for me." With a sudden, violent motion, Valerio brought the knife down across the rope. Bento watched in horror as the severed end of the hemp line snaked down into the darkness like a dying serpent. He was trapped, 30 feet below the surface in a hole of dust, with the proof of a massacre in his hands and the executioner waiting above. "Don't worry, Bento," Valerio laughed, the sound bouncing off the stone walls. "I won't leave you to starve. I'll be down there soon enough to collect those papers. And once I have them, Donna Isadora will ensure that you and that little housemaid are buried in a place where no one will ever find you." Valerio disappeared from the rim, leaving Bento in the suffocating silence of the pit. The lantern flickered, the oil running low. The blacksmith looked at the golden coins and the letter of freedom. In the dark, they were just metal and paper. They couldn't climb walls. They couldn't stop a knife. But Bento wasn't the man he had been an hour ago. The truth hadn't just given him a weapon, it had given him a soul. He looked at the jagged stone walls of the well, the uneven masonry he had helped repair years ago. He looked at his hands, the hands that had forged 1,000 chains. "I am a free man," he growled, the words echoing like a vow, "and a free man does not die in a hole." But how could he escape? The walls were slick with age, the height was impossible, and the enemy was already preparing the final blow. And what about Tiana? If he didn't move now, the broker would take her before the sun reached its zenith. The loop was closing. The blacksmith was trapped, the secret was discovered, and the villain was closing in for the kill. But what Valerio forgot was that a man who knows how to make iron also knows how to break it. Stay with me, because what Bento does next is a feat of strength and desperation that will stay with you forever. Do you think he can make it out in time? Leave your guess in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to see the confrontation that will shake the very foundations of Santa Cruz. The silence in the well was thicker than the darkness, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against Bento's lungs. Above, the distant laughter of Valerio faded into the night, leaving the blacksmith alone with the bones and the rot. The lantern flickered one last time and died, plunging the pit into absolute blackness. But Bento didn't panic. He sat in the dark, clutching the sack of documents to his chest, and for the first time in 50 years, he wasn't afraid. He was a free man, and the iron in his soul was stronger than the stones of the well. His fingers, iron-hard from 5 decades at the forge, found the first crack in the masonry. He knew this well. He had helped repair its walls 20 years ago, and he remembered every uneven stone, every hollow pocket of mortar. He began to climb. It was a slow, agonizing process. Every inch was a battle against gravity and the exhaustion that threatened to turn his muscles to water. His fingertips bled as they gripped the jagged edges, but he didn't stop. He thought of Tiana, standing on the veranda with the broker's hand on her shoulder, and the fire in his heart fueled his ascent. But he knew that getting out was only the first part of the nightmare. As he finally crested the rim of the well, gasping for air and covered in the red dust of the ridge, he didn't find the freedom he expected. A heavy boot slammed into his chest, sent him sprawling back against the stone edge. It was Valerio. The overseer hadn't left. He had been waiting in the shadows of a twisted cedar tree, watching the rat crawl out of its hole. "You're a persistent one, I'll give you that," Valerio sneered, the moonlight glinting off the silver-handled whip in his hand. He looked at the burlap sack clutched in Bento's hand, and his eyes lit up with greed. "Hand it over, blacksmith. Whatever the colonel buried down there, it belongs to the Sinha, and if you're lucky, I'll kill you quickly, instead of letting the dogs have their turn." Bento stood up slowly, his joints popping, his face a mask of terrifying calm. He didn't beg. He didn't tremble. He looked Valerio straight in the eye and spoke with a voice that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. "You can take the bag, Fator, but you can't stop what's already been set in motion." Valerio hesitated, unsettled by the lack of fear in the man he had spent years tormenting. "What are you talking about?" "Solsimo isn't the only one who remembers the families of the ridge," Bento said, his voice cold and steady. "Before I came to this ridge tonight, I gave the most damning pages, the ones with the judge's signature and the bloodstains, to a messenger. By now those papers are halfway to the city, to the office of the abolitionist lawyers. You can kill me, but you can't kill the truth. It's out of the hole now." Valerio let out a guttural roar of fury and swung the whip. The leather cracked across Bento's shoulder, but the blacksmith didn't even flinch. He allowed the overseer to drag him toward the mounting block near the senzala, where a crowd of terrified workers was already gathering in the grey light of dawn. Valerio wanted a public execution to restore the order that was rapidly slipping through his fingers. "Look at him," Valerio screamed to the gathered workers. "Look at the man who thought he was a master. He found a hole of dust and thought it was a throne." But the workers didn't look away in shame. They saw Bento standing on the block, bruised and bleeding, yet taller than he had ever been. He wasn't a slave being punished. He was a witness. But this was just the setup for the final blow. The narrator's voice drops to a whisper, because the sun was now rising over the big house, and the labor broker was already leading Tiana toward the gate. Bento knew he had to play his final card, or all the gold in the world wouldn't be enough to save her. And it is here that the story reaches its breaking point. If you think the blacksmith has reached his limit, you are mistaken. The most cinematic confrontation in the history of the Paraíba Valley is about to begin inside the very house Bento was forbidden to enter. Will the truth be enough to stop the sale? Or will the widow's corruption prove stronger than the blacksmith's iron? Stay with me for the final chapter, because the fall of Donna Isidora is something you have to see to believe. Bento did not wait for the overseer's permission. He did not wait for the whip to crack again. With a strength that seemed to come from the very earth he had just escaped, he broke free from Valerio's grasp and marched toward the big house. For 50 years he had been forbidden from crossing that threshold, but today he didn't knock. He kicked the double doors open, the heavy oak thudding against the silk-lined walls. Inside the opulent parlor, the judge, the labor broker, and Donna Isidora froze, their faces pale with shock at the sight of the bloodied, dust-covered blacksmith standing on their fine Persian rugs. "I have the master's debt," Bento announced, his voice ringing through the halls like a funeral bell. He threw the lead-lined ledger onto the mahogany table right in front of the judge. "And I have the truth that was buried in the dark. This land does not belong to the Custodio family. It never did. It belongs to the men your husband murdered to build this house of lies." Donna Isidora let out a shrill, desperate laugh. "He's a slave. He's a thief. Valerio, kill him." But the judge, seeing the imperial seals on the original deeds and the list of bribes that included his own predecessor's name, raised a trembling hand. The room went silent as he realized the weight of the papers. Bento leaned in, his eyes burning. "And before you think of burning those, know that copies are already with the abolitionist lawyers in the city. The fire has started, Sinha, and your house is made of paper." The fall was total. Within hours, the local authorities, fearing the scandal that would reach the capital, were forced to act. Donna Isidora was not just ruined, she was revealed as a common fraud. The plantation was seized to pay the debts of a generation of theft, and the woman who had spat into the well was left with nothing but the dust she had mocked. But Bento did not stay to watch the ruins. He used the gold from the hidden chamber to buy the freedom of Tiana and 6 other families, taking them far from the blood-soaked soil of the valley. They moved toward the blue-misted mountains, establishing a small, independent community of craftsmen where no man would ever forge a chain for another. Years later, the ridge at Santa Cruz looked different. The big house was a skeleton of rot, but the old stone well was no longer a hole of dust. Having been cleared of the debris and the master's sins, a natural spring had begun to bubble up from the depths, filling the stone circle with clear, cool water. Bento stood at the edge of the property one last time, watching Tiana, now a young woman, lead a group of children to the water. Dignity is not something granted by a master. It is the light found at the bottom of the darkest well. Bento looked at his hands, then at the blacksmith's hammer he had carried for a lifetime. With a final, peaceful sigh, he dropped the heavy tool into the water, watching it sink until it vanished. His days of forging chains were over. He was, at last, a man of peace. If this story touched your soul and reminded you that truth always finds its way to the light, please subscribe to our channel to support more narratives like this. I would love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below with a rating from 0 to 10 for Bento's journey. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.